Chapter 6. James Jim Callow, an early Douglas boatman and boat owner. 1864 to 1937. James Callow was born May 22, 1864 in Douglas, Isle of Man, and christened at St. Thomas's Church, Douglas, June 4, 1864. He was the 10th and youngest child of Sergeant William Callow, a Douglas policeman, and Jane Gelling. Being the youngest in the family, he would have been spared experiencing the sad deaths of 6 of his siblings. Although he was born prior to compulsory civil registration, which began in 1878, there is a record of his date of birth because it was noted by the chaplain of St. Thomas's on his baptismal certificate. This chaplain showed some initiative, since recording dates of birth was not a requirement and not recorded in other churches on the island at that time. The passing of the Education Act of 1872 made school education compulsory for all Manx children between the ages of 7 and 13. For the first time, management of schools was under control of elected school boards and costs derived from taxes. James Callow benefited from the passing of this act and likely attended the National School of St. Barnabas's on Fort Street. He would have received a maximum of 7 years of education in the 3 hours in poorly ventilated rooms with limited sanitary facilities. His own children would continue to receive only 7 years of education as they could not afford the fees for a high school education, and further education was not highly regarded by many working families. An exception may have been made for 1 or 2 of his children who won a scholarship to high school. James Callow did, however, encourage trades training for each of his sons. 8 Road Hill was James Callow's place of birth and also his address at the time of his marriage to Margaret Elizabeth Killy of Castletown on April 11, 1886. On his marriage certificate he is identified as a boatman, but on all the birth certificates of his 10 children dating from 1887 to 1908, and on the 1891 and 1901 census, he is recorded as a trade painter, which probably would have been his main occupation during the tourist off-season. He likely continued to work as a house painter during World War I when pleasure boating was suspended. A photo from that period shows him dressed in a painter's smock and apron. His obituary in the Isle of Man Times suggests that he was working as a boatman in the 1890s with his father, who died in 1897. December 18, 1937. Isle of Man Times. Well-known boatman's sudden death. Douglas, yesterday by the sudden death of James Callow, has lost another of its links with the past. Mr. Callow, who was 73 years old, was found dead in his bed yesterday morning. Ever since the Loch Promenade was built, Mr. Callow and his father before him have carried on a boating and yachting business from the Sefton Steps. He had seen the growth of the visiting season, and was exceedingly well known to many hundreds of regular visitors who hired his boats year after year and consulted with him on the best places to fish. One of his customers was a Chinese prince who stopped at Ft. An hotel, and hired one of Mr. Callow's yachts for a period of his visit. His knowledge of the management of small craft and currents around Douglas was unrivaled. And he will be missed by many regular visitors and a host of friends. The funeral will take place tomorrow, Sunday. Another short announcement dated December 17, 1937, the day of his death, also appeared on the front page of the Isle of Man Examiner. Veteran boatman's sudden death. Mr. James Callow, of Circular Road, well-known veteran boatman, was found dead in bed today. Mr. Callow was one of the old school, and conducted a successful boating and yachting business from the Sefton Steps every season. A family story claims that very early in his career, he skippered yachts between Douglas and Castletown for wealthy owners. His wife was from Castletown, so it must have been on one such yachting trip when he first met her. One day while in Castletown, he threw a package of tobacco over the wall of Castle Rushen Jail, to a friend imprisoned there. He got caught and spent a night in the jail himself. We do not know what year this incident occurred, but it must have happened before the closing of the Castle Rushen prison for civilians in 1891. A military prison also at the castle was retained until at least 1894. In late Victorian and Edwardian times, Douglas had a good reputation for regattas of high standing in the yachting and rowing communities. The Prince of Wales, for example, entered a racing yacht each year during the 1890s. Regattas were held annually at Douglas as well as Castletown, Peel, and Ramsey. It is quite possible that James Callow was involved with such activities, but there is no confirming oral history available since all his children are now deceased, as well as his older grandchildren who might also have heard family stories about him when he was a young man. Available regatta programs of the 1890s shed no light since they list yacht owners but not skippers or crew members. Rowing boats were very popular among the visitors, tourists, in Victorian times, and their popularity continued until after World War II. When the boating business was at its peak in the Isle of Man prior to World War II, approximately 300 rowing boats were available for hire at all the Manx ports and even remote beaches and creeks around the island. Some 150 of these rowing boats were located along the Douglas Promenade. The boats were often owned by family businesses and handed down from father to son. In the case of the Callows, retired Police Sergeant William Callow, according to his probated will of 1897, was in partnership with his son John William Henry Callow and owned 13 small pleasure boats and 2 sailing yachts. John W. H. Callow operated this boat hire business by the Broadway Steps, which is located across the promenade from the former Central Hotel, now converted into apartments. When he died in 1927, his brother James Callow took over this operation and placed his son Percy in charge. James Callow apparently got established in his own boating business in the mid-1890s. He eventually owned a string of 20 rowing boats which he operated from the beach below the Sefton Steps located across the promenade from the Sefton Hotel, and for a time after 1927, another fleet of rowing boats, previously operated by his brother on the beach by the Broadway Steps. He also owned at any given time 2 or 3 sailing yachts which he used for taking visitors, tourists, fishing, or for daily trips to Port Soderick, a popular tourist destination, 3 miles south of Douglas. One of the sailing boats was replaced in the 1920s by a motor launch for the Port Soderick run. Each evening the rowing boats were rowed from the concession areas on the beach to the swing bridge or inner harbour where they were moored overnight, and in the morning they were rowed back again. One strong rower could tow as many as 10 boats provided that the tide was right and the boatman could get them moving. After motor launches were introduced in the 1920s, a boat owner could tow all of his rowing boats in one trip. It used to be a common sight early in the morning and at tea time to see strings of these boats moving along the bay. As soon as his sons and some of his grandsons were old enough, they were employed in various aspects of the business. He also employed men to skipper his yachts and motor launch. 2 of these skippers were Eddie Brew and James Campbell. The sailing yachts carried 25 passengers. Some of James Callow's yachts had such names as White Heather, Rover's Bride and Genesta. Other names remembered were Eagle and the Eve, which he sold in 1934. Usually only the mainsail was used on these boats unless there was barely any wind at all, in which case the rest of the sails would go up. Sometimes the added sails were not enough to keep a boat moving and the crew of 2 would have to start rowing with 15-foot oars or allow the boat to drift towards shore and wait for a tow from the motor launch when it returned from Port Soderick. Some of the other long-time family-owned boat hire businesses in Douglas included the Swindlehurst, Ash, Stowell, Reedshaw, Sale, Ronnie, Corran and Lee families. These surnames were also prominent among the members of the Royal National Lifeboat Institution boat crews. In the 1920s and 30s, there were 7 boat owners with motor launches that made the run from the Douglas promenades to Port Soderick. James Callow's boat, the Renown, was one of 8 motor launches that carried 12 passengers. One boat owner, John Swindlehurst, had 2 such motor launches. A larger boat, the Carina, owned by the Forrester family, carried 40 passengers, and for a time they also operated another boat, the Roma, that carried 50 passengers. These larger boats ran from the ferry steps on Victoria Pier. Besides the owners of the smaller motor launches and sailing yachts, there were other boat owners who had only rowing boats to hire out along the beach at Douglas. After the death of James Callow in 1937, his boats were sold to various Douglas boat owners. The Renown, which had a 7-horsepower Kelvin engine, was sold to Thomas Reed Shaw but was commandeered by the British Navy in 1939. According to family law, the Renown was used in Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of 350,000 British and French forces from Dunkirk May 26 to June 4, 1940. Thomas Reed Shaw's Renown was, however, not actually used in the evacuation. The British Navy had commandeered more small ships than were actually sent to Dunkirk. A cockle boat from Leigh-on-Sea, Essex, also named the Renown, was one of 200 small privately owned boats that never returned. It was sunk by a mine on June 1, 1940, while being towed back to its home port in English waters. All 4 crew members were killed. Also listed among the small privately owned ships that participated in Operation Dynamo is a boat called the Eve, which sank due to being overloaded. The skipper was a leading seaman in the RNR. It has not been confirmed whether this boat was the same one that James Callow sold in 1934. Each licensed boat on the island was inspected annually and a certificate issued. A record was kept in a register of the owner's name, the boat's measurements, number of passengers allowed and the number of crew required. For example, a 1939 entry for the Renown read as follows: Thomas Reed Shaw, 5 Hillside Avenue, Renown, keel 34-4, beam 9'2, depth 3'9. Number of passengers allowed 12, boatmen to be carried 2, May 29, 1939. Horse-drawn landing stages were used to assist the passengers on the beach to get in and out of the rowing boats. Each boat owner along the beach had 2 landing stages consisting of heavy planks carried on 2 axles with 4 large cart wheels. One stage was pulled out into the water by 2 draft horses, while the other stage on the beach was backed seaward by another team of draft horses. A long, springy plank connected the 2 stages. Each landing stage had a bench on one side and could carry 15 to 20 passengers standing up. Landing stages were moved back and forth according to the tide. If the seawater reached the seawall, the stages were pulled up and weighted with stones. The horses could then have a rest. After World War II, the use of horses for moving landing stages was banned and their work had to be carried out manually by the boatmen. Passengers going to Port Soderick were rowed out to the motor launch, where they climbed aboard on a boarding ladder. Ideas concerning horses walking in seawater have changed since such a practice was banned by the SPCA at the end of World War II. Veterinarians, according to a recent newspaper report, recommended a therapeutic dip in the sea for a Douglas tram horse with a hoof abscess. Furthermore, according to the same article, most tram horses apparently enjoy a swim in the ocean. The landing stage wheels, when first purchased, had 4-inch rims. The rims had to be taken apart and replaced by broad, heavy 8-inch rims. An uncle of Bobby Ash, a long-time Douglas boatman, was a wheelwright who made a good living just replacing wheel rims. In the off-season, most of the rowing boats known locally in more recent times as Rowies, were stored by the dozen in an upended position in what was known as the boat field. This area was located on the grounds of the nunnery, which was owned by Major Fry Goldie Taubman. The nunnery estate, now the site of the Isle of Man International Business School, is located beside the Douglas River 800 meters upstream from the Douglas Inner Harbor. In the spring, the boat field was a hive of activity for about 2 months, as the boats were repaired and painted for the summer season. James Callow, however, stored his rowboats in a yard near his home on Circular Road and did his maintenance work throughout the winter. His yachts and motor launch were moored in the Douglas River. Boatmen made almost all of their income in the tourist season, which was from June to mid-September. In the winter, some of them went fishing in their motorboats but often returned empty-handed, especially in later years. James Callow, on the other hand, never went fishing in the winter but spent his time making new clinker-built rowing boats, repairing his existing rowboats as well as repairing or renovating his yachts, which he sometimes would sell at a profit. He could build a rowing boat worth £15 in about 3 weeks. All work was done manually without any sophisticated machinery. He usually began construction of a rowing boat in his back basement and completed work outdoors in his backyard. One very cold winter while living at 87 Circular Road, he went too far with the work indoors and had to take out a back window in order to get the boat out of the house. The rowing boats could be of different lengths. Some carried 2 to 4 people and a few 6 passengers. James Callow had the distinction of having the largest rowing boat on the shore. It could carry 9 passengers and was very heavy to row. Boat registrations for the Port of Douglas before 1939 are missing, but registrations for other Manx ports have been retained to pre-World War I. The rise and decline of the tourist industry in the Isle of Man was directly reflected in the increase and decrease of pleasure boat registrations. Registration numbers were painted on either side of the front of each boat as well as a name given by the owner. Rowing boats were commonly given the names of female relatives. If the Douglas boat registrations had been kept prior to 1939, the writer might have been tempted to match all the names of James Callow's rowing boats with the names of his daughters, daughters-in-law and granddaughters. The names of some of the rowing boats as remembered by one relative now deceased, included Lily, Mona, Doris, Daisy, and Nestor. In the late 1980s some of James Callow's rowing boats could still be seen at a storage yard beside Milequist's garage when it was still on Westmoreland Road. At that time, the hulls of these boats were painted blue but the sides retained the original varnish finish now blackened with age. All the boat owners had advertising boards measuring 3 feet by 2 feet to help promote their business. These boatmen's stands were positioned at the various steps on the seawall that protects Douglas Promenade and were therefore readily accessible to the beach. James Callow's stand was by the Sefton Steps, which was located across from the Sefton Hotel. A photograph of his stand shows that one board provided details on departure times of his 2 sailing yachts used for fishing as well as the schedule of his motor launch to Port Soderick. A second board duplicates the same information about the Port Soderick trip but also quotes the return fare of 2 shillings. The schedules of the other boat owners were similar. Most of the words on the billboard illustrated in the photo of James Callow's stand at the Sefton Steps can be transcribed as follows. Sefton Steps. Mackerel fishing. Large sailing yachts. Dash. Morning at 6 and 6:30 returning 8 and 8:30. 10 and 10:30 12:30. Afternoon 2 and 2:30 returning 5 p.m. Port Soderick. Motor launch. Morning at 10 and 10:30 a.m. returning 12:30. Afternoon at 2 and 2:30 p.m. returning 5 p.m. Rowing boats for hire. For private parties. Most of the line above is covered by images of fish and so unreadable. But might say special times for private parties. The lower board is much easier to read. Book here for motor launch. To Port Soderick. Morning 6 and 6:30 returning 12:30. Afternoon 2 and 2:35. Evening 7-9. Port Soderick. By motor launch. Return. Fare. 2/. Boat owners always had fish hanging up by their stands to attract customers and give the impression that fishing was good whether it was or not. If no fish were caught during the day, the fish already hanging up would be swished with seawater and put back up on display. If no fish were caught a second day, the fish on display would be rinsed again and again hung up. If after 3 days with no fresh replacements and with a hot sun, there would be such a strong smell that passers-by would have to hold their noses because of the stench. In the picture of James Callow's stand there are several dozen fish of different kinds hanging on lines tied to a horizontal rod which is attached to a pole immediately behind the advertisement boards. They are draped not only on either side of the billboards but over the top board as well, thus obscuring part of it. To complete the decor several Union Jacks are displayed and as an added touch, a cigarette or two might be placed in a fish's mouth. Mackerel were regularly exhibited, but to create further interest for potential customers, other less common fish caught in Douglas Bay such as collig, snipefish, plaice, herring, blocken, young coalfish or coley, and conger reels might also be displayed. Mackerel were abundant in the deep waters of the headlands, especially off Douglas Head, a promontory on the south side of the harbour. All the boatmen were good salesmen and would hail potential customers with calls such as Port Soderick, rowing and fishing. Officially, boatmen were not allowed to shout or even speak while on the seawall steps or the promenade. Shouting from the beach was permitted. 3 car inspectors, employees of Douglas Borough, who patrolled the promenade, could levy fines of 10 shillings and costs for shouting, but a boatman couldn't be fined if he spoke to a potential customer who had approached him. The visitors liked to have their pictures taken with the boatman, and like other boatmen, James Callow could be found in photos that were likely scattered throughout the UK. Participating in picture-taking would be all part of good public relations, and James Callow seemed to be adept at getting old ladies without teeth to smile for their pictures. Each night when the weather was good, the rowing boats were towed by the motor launch to the swing bridge which crosses Douglas Inner Harbour and left there overnight. During stormy weather they were brought into the inner harbour. There were quite a few mishaps over the years and cases where a boat owner would lose nearly his whole fleet. Storms moving inward from the sea would be the most concern, but on one occasion in 1938, 6 months after James Callow's death, a severe flood of the Douglas River due to torrential rains caused rowboats moored in the inner harbour to be carried out by the flood and smashed to pieces against several bridges, and a few even swept out to sea. The boat owners were then obliged to pick up all the pieces in the name of conservation. Veteran boatmen could sense the coming of bad weather and if necessary would move their boats to the inner harbour in the middle of the night. However, a flash flood such as occurred in 1938 was rare and would be difficult to predict. Since we are dealing with an era before cell phones and the common use of radios, boat owners carried whistles that they used to signal the skippers of their boats. The whistles were used mainly to call back their motor launches starting off for Port Soderick, if they were only 200 or 300 yards offshore, didn't have a full complement of 12 passengers, and others on shore had just bought their tickets and could fill the boat. James Callow's method of signalling was somewhat unique in that he used a manual foghorn to get attention and then started waving. Because of their apparel, the Manx boatmen always looked like they belonged by the sea. They wore thick black sailors' jackets, jumpers, black serge trousers, flat caps and waders, and never changed to lighter clothing in warm weather. Since James Callow spent most of his time in the summer promoting business on shore, he dressed sometimes quite stylishly. He can be seen in photos wearing a suit jacket with a pocket handkerchief and either a captain-style cap or a straw hat. He was even known to wear a blue pinstripe suit with his captain's cap. Anything to attract the attention of potential customers was used, since competition among the boatmen could be intense. Although there was considerable boat traffic in Douglas Bay, there were few accidents. The boatmen were adept at anticipating the movement of the steam packet ferries and other large boats. They were also usually adept at keeping out of view of the harbour master, if they carried more passengers than their licence permitted. The harbour master, who was stationed at Victoria Pier, wore a white hat which could easily be spotted at a distance. Sometimes, however, he might get around this problem by carrying his hat behind his back as he walked along the harbour. Typically it would take half an hour by motor launch to Port Soderick. The passengers were allowed to stay 1 hour on shore before the return trip. Those passengers that went out on the morning trip might overstay their time on shore and expect to get back on the afternoon return trip. The boatmen would oblige but were subject to a fine if observed by the harbour master. The fine was 10 shillings and costs, and if caught twice their boats had to stay on shore for 2 weeks. Although the Douglas boating industry nearly shut down completely during both World Wars, one long-time custom involving rowing boats was maintained through the war years. Every Easter Monday halfpenny sails across Douglas Harbour were offered for children. These trips were considered a big adventure by the children and were duly reported and photographed by local newspapers. James Callow was a good friend of Colby McCubbin, 1901 to 1951, a well-known eccentric millionaire. Their common interest was boats, which they could discuss for hours. Colby McCubbin was an engineer by training. His father and uncle were builders in Liverpool, and they acquired a considerable amount of property and wealth in that city. A story told about him by older generations demonstrated the power of wealth in an amusing way. He was known to get rid of Douglas Borough employees who had been sent with compressors to do road work in front of his house in Douglas. He had the habit of pursuing his hobby as an amateur radio operator throughout the night and sleeping during the day. Not wanting to have his sleep disturbed, he paid the town workers their wages and told them to work somewhere else. One spring he was called upon to substitute for the boat examiner who was ill. He had a unique method of analyzing engines by using an ordinary hammer and listening through the wooden handle to diagnose potential engine problems. The teller of this particular anecdote concluded in an understated way by saying, "There was something wrong there." One very worthwhile contribution he made to the island that didn't involve huge sums of money was that he, along with 2 other breeders, helped save the Loughton sheep from near extinction. Douglas Inner Harbour at low tide was a mudflat with a trickle of water representing the Douglas River running down the middle. It was still common to see dozens of rowing boats lined up on the mudflat even in the 1980s, but in the last decade of the 20th century, there were very few to be seen. The exact year the last Douglas boatman, Frank Shimin, was in business is not known by the writer, 1999, but was before 2004 when Douglas Inner Harbour became a marina as a result of the construction of a Kfa Dam, which has created an artificial lake within the inner harbour and a constant level of water unaffected by the tides. During the summer season and with a sharp eye, one might still see 1 or 2 rowing boats on the Douglas beach, but the era of the rowing boat has long passed. The family of James Callow and Margaret Killy consisted of 8 sons and 2 daughters. All were born in Douglas. They were 1. Bertie William Drury Callow, 1887 to 1956. He moved to Barrow in Furness at the beginning of World War I. He worked as a trade painter at the Vickers shipyard, which after 1927 became Vickers Armstrong, and was employed there for the rest of his working life. Until about 1930, he also painted houses in partnership with an unrelated Callow. He married Lily Caruish 1909 in Douglas. They had 2 sons and a daughter born in Douglas and 2 daughters and a son born in Barrow. He married secondly Elizabeth Conder in 1942 at Barrow and had 1 son. In 1941, his home in Barrow was destroyed as a result of a bombing raid. Barrow came under an intense bombing attack between April and May 1941. The main targets for the bombers were the shipyards, steelworks and docks, but most bombs missed their targets and fell in residential areas. During the Second World War, Bertie Callow was an ARP, Air Aid Patrol, volunteer warden at Barrow. When the Royal Navy was anxious to get new warships into service, he was sometimes required to sit on a scaffold hanging from the side of a ship and carry on painting as the ship underwent trials at sea. He died in Laxey and was buried in England. 2. Percy Pritchard Callow, 1890 to 1972, joined the British Army November 27, 1915 in Douglas. More details of his service are available because his discharge papers and application for a pension were found amongst the burnt files of British soldiers' World War I service records. These files provide details of personal and medical records but are uninformative as to what a soldier actually did while in the service. On enlistment at age 25, Percy Callow was recorded as a house painter and fisherman. His employer was Mark Corinne, a prominent Manx contractor whose firm built Noble's Hospital in Douglas. His national health provider was the Amalgamated Society of House and Ship Painters, a benefits-rich trade union based in Manchester. He served 3 years and 120 days in 5 different units of the Army. They were the Army Ordnance Corps, 1 year and 120 days, the Royal Flying Corps, 1 year and 49 days, and 2 infantry regiments, 243 days in total, which were the 18th Bat. King's Royal Rifle Corps and the 12th Bat. London Regiment. While in the infantry, he served 81 days in France. On August 25, 1918 at the Second Battle of the Somme, he received a bullet wound in the right thigh and shrapnel in the right knee joint. The latter injury was not detected until later. After recuperating in England, he was transferred to the motor transport of the Army Service Corps and served 112 days as a learner driver of heavy vehicles. Prior to discharge February 13, 1919, he applied for a pension and was examined by an army doctor who discovered the shrapnel in his right knee joint, had it removed and rejected his pension application. After demobilization, he was transferred to Class Z Army Reserve, which meant he could return to civilian life but was subject to call-up. There were fears that Germany would not accept the terms of the peace treaty, and the British government decided that it would be prudent to be able to recall trained men if hostilities resumed. This category was abolished March 31, 1920. He resumed work as a house painter, a trade he pursued for the rest of his working life. For a number of summer seasons after 1927, he operated the boat hire business for his father by the Broadway steps. He married Violet Jackson at Seacombe, Cheshire in 1915. They had twin daughters born 1918 Douglas. One daughter died at birth. 3. James J. Ernest Callow, 1891–1949, worked as a fisherman, joiner and a caretaker at the Douglas Town Hall. After World War II until his death he was a market inspector for the Douglas Borough. He married Elizabeth Rogers in 1913. At St. George's, Douglas. They had 6 daughters and a son, all born in Douglas. During World War I, he was a sailor on the Lancashire Lass, which was commandeered by the Royal Navy to serve in the English Channel. In World War II, he contracted rheumatic fever while serving in B. Douglas Company, 1st Manx Battalion of the Home Guard. All units of the Home Guard units were disbanded December 31, 1944. 4. Harold Harry Douglas Callow, 1892–1969, was a trade painter in Douglas. In World War I, he was as a private in a contingent from the 6th Service Battalion of the South Lancashire Regiment that served in the Mesopotamia campaign. He married Helen May McClure 1914 at St. Ninians, Douglas. They had 3 sons and 2 daughters born in Douglas. 5. Wilfred Edgar Callow, 1895–1934, joined the Isle of Man Volunteers August 9, 1915 as a private who later transferred to the 11th Battalion of the Cheshire Regiment, which saw action in France and Flanders, Belgium. He was wounded, gassed and taken prisoner in 1918. The Manx newspaper report of his capture stated he was unwounded. The units in which he served at the front were involved in several battles collectively known as the Third Battle of Ypres, which took place between July and November 1917. The battles were fought in very bad conditions, the result of driving rain and waterlogged ground filled with shell holes. The Allies lost 300,000 casualties for the gain of only few miles. In civilian life he was a fisherman, farm laborer and a builder's laborer. He married Caroline Kelly 1923 at Caerhoncan. They had 2 daughters. He died at the age of 39, probably due to a weakened condition brought on by his war injuries. 6. Walter Killy Callow, 1898–1961, joined the army at age 16. He was a sapper in the 6th Siege Company, Royal Monmouthshire Regiment, Royal Engineers. He was detached for some time to regiments which served in France and Flanders. He was wounded and gassed and recuperated in a convalescent hospital in England. He was awarded the Silver War Badge because on discharge he was considered permanently physically unfit. In civilian life he was originally a trade painter and later for many years a sign writer. He married Lily Fowkes in 1923 in Manchester. They had 2 daughters born in Douglas. 7. John Edward Callow, 1901 to 1942, was a mechanic. He was employed for a time by Heron and Braley, a wine and spirits dealer, and lastly as foreman at Messrs. Vincent Bucknell and Company, Douglas, which was a related company. Cajoled by fellow workers, he enlisted at the age of 39 in the Royal Army Ordnance Corps, and 4.5 months later, according to one local newspaper report, died of gunshot wounds, actually machine gun fire from an enemy aircraft, in the west of England, where he was attached to a Royal Artillery regiment. Where in England he was killed is not known. The British government was desperate not to reveal to the enemy just how much damage and how many casualties the Luftwaffe had inflicted, and kept all such reports low-key. It is possible that his place of death, possibly Liverpool, is recorded in his personal records, which are restricted until 2020 except to immediate next of kin. A family story claims that he died after seeking cover under a lorry which was sprayed by machine gun fire from a German raider. He had been scheduled to return home on leave 2 days after his death. The Manx newspaper's Roll of Honour provides this information. J. Callow, 82, Hazel Cress, Pulrose Rayoch, died of wounds received in action against enemy aircraft in England September 7, 1940. He married Annie Blanche Clegg in 1925. They had 1 son and 1 daughter. Their sons' grandchildren include 3 boys who are the last members of James Callow's descendants to continue the surname Callow on the island. 8. Charles Oswald Callow, 1904 to 1982, was an apprentice to a fishmonger, farm labourer and motor van driver before emigrating to Edmonton, Alberta in 1928. When a boy, his foot was crushed by one of his father's draft horses and he walked with a limp the rest of his life. Nevertheless, he always loved horses. During the economic depression in Canada in the 1930s, he worked as a milkman using a horse-drawn open wagon. In the winter, temperatures could reach -40 and frozen milk would rise several inches above the tops of the bottles. After 1940, he resumed work as a lorry driver for a grocery wholesale company. He married Ethel Coe in 1926 in Douglas. They had 1 daughter born in Douglas and 1 son born in Edmonton, Alberta. 9. Elsie Mona Lintern née Callow, 1906 to 1976, known as Mona, continued to live in the family home at 87 Circular Road for some time, but later moved to Onchan. She was a clerk in a pork butcher's shop in Douglas before marrying John Trevelyan Lintern, a bricklayer, in 1932. He was a sergeant major in the 15th Isle of Man, Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment RA during World War II. They had 1 daughter born in Douglas. 10. Margaret Daisy Annie Moore née Callow, 1908 to 1988, inherited the family home jointly with her sister, Mona. She was married in 1933 to Frank Moore, a baker who later became an insurance agent. They had 1 daughter. The Callow family lived at 4 different addresses in Douglas over the years. The eldest son was born in 1887 at Westview Cottage, presumably near Westview Terrace. The next 4 sons were born between 1890 and 1895 at Hope Terrace behind Hope Street. This building was still in existence in 1996 but has since been partially demolished, and what remains in 2007, numbers 7 to 10, is still inhabited but is in very poor condition and likely will soon be demolished. The next 4 children were born between 1898 and 1906, Cumberland Terrace off Circular Road. This terrace was demolished in the early 1990s. The youngest child was born in 1908. At 80A Circular Road, and it too has been demolished. About 1918, the family moved to 87 Circular Road, and at this address James Callow died in 1937 and his wife Margaret in 1946. 87 Circular Road, which still exists, is part of a Victorian-age terrace, townhouses. This dwelling was on 3 levels, each with 2 large rooms. The bottom level had access to the backyard, which in the British sense means an enclosed paved area. All the dwellings in the block have paved backyards on either side of the lane, and there is not a tree, flower nor blade of grass to be seen anywhere. Later owners left number 87 in a near ruinous condition. The roof was leaking and water dripping down the inside walls to the ground level. Fortunately, the house was purchased in the early 1990s and renovated into flats. At present, it has been converted into an architect's office and given the name of Ocean House. After the renovations into flats, a young ex-soldier who rented the ground floor flat, claimed to have seen apparitions on the property. He would see a woman and a child come in through the downstairs door, move along the hall, turn, go up the stairs and out a back window. He also used to see an apparition near a top floor back window, of a man smoking a pipe while sitting in a rocking chair. He claimed not to be easily frightened, but what he saw made him very nervous, so he moved out. These happenings, if true, may have had some connection with people who lived in the house while it was in serious disrepair. Such events would have started after the last Callow family member, a daughter, Mona Callow, Linton, had moved out, because neither she nor lodgers who stayed with her were ever aware of anything unusual in the house. Since the arrival of the architects, there apparently have been no further sightings. James Callow was considered a quiet, polite man who never got angry except once with a certain harbour master who was very officious and got under the skins of many of the boatmen and captains. He didn't have any special training, and to the relief of many was replaced by someone who had proper certification. James Callow was generous to his employees but sometimes a taskmaster to his children even as adults. He owned a car but never drove, always relying on his son Walter to take him wherever he wished. The diesel engine on the motor launch could be temperamental, and whenever there was a problem with it, he would call upon his son John, a mechanic, to make the repair, but without any compensation. James Callow's motor car was a 11/9 HP Morris Cowley 4-seater grey 1700 weight, license MN 5968. It was registered from 5th of April 1930 to 19th of November 1935 to his son Walter Killy Callow, but bought and owned by his father who couldn't drive. As a result, Walter Callow was somewhat at the beck and call to his father whenever he wanted a ride. He was short-sighted and regularly carried a sighting scope. He was very protective of his 2 daughters and forbade them to go out at night on their own. One evening while he was out, his daughters Mona and Daisy slipped out of the house and were making their way to a dance when they encountered their father walking in the opposite direction across the street. Rather than trying to hide, they called out in unison, "Good evening, Mr. Callow," and he politely touched his hat and continued on his way. A small newspaper clipping that was in the possession of a member of the eldest son of James Callow shows a picture of him chatting with 2 beach pajama-clad women on Douglas Promenade. The date of this clipping is unknown, but must have been printed in the 1920s or 30s, when this type of garment was worn by wealthy women on promenades or perhaps on sailing boats. There is a caption that says "Fresh Tales of the Sea by an Old Salt." A story adventure being recounted to 2 pajama-clad holiday girls at Douglas. James Callow was likely picked by the reporter to represent an old salt because he was quite photogenic, but whether he was actually recounting tall tales of the sea or trying to persuade the young women to go sailing or rowing in one of his boats, we will never know. James Callow and his wife Margaret Killy spoke Manx to each other whenever they wanted to have a private conversation and not have their children and grandchildren know what they were saying. It is unlikely they spoke fluent Manx, but rather used words and phrases that were part of the Anglo-Manx dialect, which was still in use in the early part of the 20th century. Whatever Manx they did know, they made a point of not passing it on to their children or grandchildren. This couple had 33 grandchildren, of whom 29 were born in the Isle of Man, 3 in Barrow-in-Furness and 1 in Canada. 42 of their 63 great-grandchildren were born in the Isle of Man, 12 in England, 3 in the Republic of Ireland and 6 in Canada. The exact number of their great-great-grandchildren has not been determined but includes descendants born in the Isle of Man, 31+, England, 11+, Ireland, 4+, France, 1, Canada, 6, Costa Rica, 2, and Australia. James Callow was a long-time ordinary member of the Independent Order of Rechabites. The Rechabite order was largely active in the UK and the Isle of Man but also in other English-speaking countries such as America, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. James Callow became a member of this friendly society in 1890. Friendly or mutual benefit societies provided sickness and death benefits to all their members and appointed doctors to do medical examinations on new members and attend to sick members. Wealthier lodges also granted mortgages on a limited basis. Membership in such organizations was of great appeal since the benefits they provided were available long before the introduction of government social insurance schemes. The Rechabites were different from other friendly societies in that they stressed temperance and required members to take the pledge. The name Rechabites derives from the biblical tribe who were commanded to drink no wine. The order consisted of branches, lodges, known as tents, which is a reference to the biblical Rechabites who as nomads lived only in tents in the desert. There were during the peak membership of the movement on the island in the 1890s as many as 16 tents, 3,000 adult members and 2,000 juvenile members, under the age of 16. The Rechabites modeled their ritual, titles and structure along biblical and tribal lines and imitated the rituals of Freemasonry. The adult officers of the society had some unusual titles such as the High Chief Ruler, who presided over a conference of 9 districts of which 8 were in the UK, and was assisted by a High Deputy Ruler. Each district had a District Chief Ruler and a Deputy District Ruler. The Isle of Man was District Number 6, which had as many as 16 tents. Each tent had a chief ruler or chairman assisted by a deputy chief ruler, a past chief ruler, a corresponding secretary, a tent steward, an assistant at meetings, a sick steward who visited the sick, guardians who only allowed members to enter, a Levite of the tent who had various functions including arranging the meeting hall, distributing and collecting the regalia and setting the password. By the 1890s the stewards were renamed the book steward who marked the contribution cards and the cash steward who received the contributions from members and paid them to the treasurer. The juvenile tents were administered at the conference level by the High Superintendent of Juvenile Tents and at the tent level a Superintendent of Juvenile Tents who provided overall supervision of the children's meetings. In correspondence and the newspapers all the titles were abbreviated to letters such as DCR etc. Adult members addressed each other as brother or sister and their surname. Adult members typically paid a regular membership fee and went to tent meetings to take part in ceremonies which included reciting the Pledge of Abstinence. Members who were sick received an allowance. Both stewards would visit sick members in order to provide emotional support and make sure there was no malingering. Rechabite membership gradually started to decrease with the introduction of the old age pension in 1908 and the National Health Insurance Plan in 1910, but still had significant number of members on the island well after World War II. In 1993, it ceased to exist except as a mutual insurance company operating under the trading name of Healthy Investment. For their time, the Rechabites and other friendly societies provided a valuable service to their members not only for social services but also the opportunity for social gatherings for both adults and children. For early members, it was their first opportunity to express their wishes through the democratic process of voting for officers and activities. Only in 1867 did members of the previously self-elected Tynwald first have to stand for election. Records of the Manx Rechabite tents are kept at the Manx National Heritage Library. In Douglas, members of the Callow family can be found listed in a file labelled District and Tent Records removed from the Allen Street Rechabite Hall. These records pertain to the Mono Union tent in Douglas, which in 1836 was the first tent to be established on the island. Recorded for each new member were the registered number, name, occupation, date of birth, and date of admission. James Callow and 2 of his sons, Percy and J, are listed. Number 1645 James Callow painter 22563, joined, 1890. Sick pay insured funeral benefit. 014s, 010s, 0 for wife. Number 2282 PP Callow painter 23290 age 21 joined 27/9/1910. Number 2320 J Ernest Callow joiner 26/5/1891 age 21 date of admission the 24th of September 2012. According to old rule books, the badge of the order was either to be a sash or collar, neck ribbon, and was to be worn at all meetings. The few photos of Manx tent members and officers that have been preserved show the only sashes being worn as badges. Rules which describe the wearing of regalia at special functions such as funerals, mention only sashes. However, in a photo taken for the 1936 centennial of the movement, a group of district and past district officers are all wearing the more elaborate collar which included the image of the Rechabite emblem. From this limited information and with no written record, it is possible that on the Isle of Man, all tent-level officers and members wore sashes while the district-level officers wore collars. Annual Rechabite processions included very colourful banners and other paraphernalia, which were all very eye-catching. Each tent officer in the procession wore a white sash with 1, 2, or 3 scarlet stripes according to his position, as well as a pink rosette and a decorated apron. Officers at the district level wore blue stripes on their collars or sashes, and at the conference level purple stripes. The sashes or collars of the highest order of office holders at any level had a large panel on which was inscribed the name of their position. Ordinary members wore a white sash with a pink rosette, but if they had belonged for more than 5 consecutive years, their sashes also included 2 scarlet stripes on the edges of their sashes, the same as the lower order tent officers. Each participant in the procession carried a colored staff or a wand ornamented with various emblems. In the earlier days of the movement, many in the procession also wore silk hats and dress jackets. These parades, which were generally preceded by marching bands, sometimes 3 or 4, made quite a spectacle and were a particular delight to any children who might be watching them. All members of a tent were expected to attend the annual outdoor demonstration and were fined 2 shillings and 6pence if they failed to do so. Part of the fine was to cover a caterer's expense for a tea or dinner that was held afterwards. The brightly colored Rechabite banner, which included an elaborate emblem, was carried in all processions. On the left-hand side of the shield within the emblem, there is an angel holding a palm branch, and on the right a woman in a robe holding either a bouquet of flowers or a scroll. Beside her is a cornucopia. The shield itself has the sun, the moon and stars, a serpent, 2 doves, 3 tents, a lamb, an all-seeing eye and a rainbow. On top of the shield are a sword and olive branch, a sheaf of wheat and a skep, a traditional beehive made from wicker and straw, with bees flying around, and a twisted cord. At the bottom of the shield is the motto "Peace and Plenty, the reward of temperance." Below the motto are pictures of Noah's Ark, St. George slaying a dragon, and a lifeboat rescue at sea. Several versions of the emblem appeared over the years, but although there were differences in detail or color scheme, the main components remained the same. The symbols used in the Rechabite emblem were primarily related to texts or events in the Bible or with connections to the church, and their significance was explained in detail to all new initiates. A brief meaning of each symbol is listed below. 1. Figure of peace, angel with palm branch, peace. 2. Figure of plenty, robed woman standing beside a cornucopia, plenty. 3. Sword and olive branch, justice and peace. 4. Wheat chief, plenty. 5. Beehive, industry and order, working together for the good of all. 6. Twisted cord, strength and unity. 7. Eye, the all-seeing eye, the watchful eye of God. 8. Lamb, sacrifice. 9. Sun, gifts of God. 10. Moon and stars, perfection. 11. Serpent, poison of alcohol/wisdom. 12. Doves, gentleness. 13. The 3 tenths, branches of the order: Conference, District, Local. 14. Rainbow, Promise of God. 15. Rose, Thistle, Leek and Shamrock, Order, National and International, England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland. 16. Cornucopia, Horn of Plenty, Plenty. 17. Peace and Plenty, the Reward of Temperance, motto of the Order. 18. Ark, Safety through belonging to the Order, also the saving of humanity. 19. St. George and the Dragon, Victory over strong drink. 20. Lifeboat, Rescue. Members were also expected to attend the funeral of a member. That every member of this tent shall attend at the funeral of any of its members, if in health and residing within 2 miles of the deceased brother's residence, and shall walk with white sash and black rosette from the deceased brother's residence to the place of interment, providing it be not more than 5 miles from the deceased brother's residence, or be fined 1 shilling. The stewards are to notice the members, or appoint some person to do so. As with other fraternal organizations, the death of a Rechabite member was given a special announcement in a local paper. Such was the announcement of James Callow's funeral. Mono Union Tent, Iowa. Members are requested to attend the funeral of their late brother James Callow of 87. Circular Road, Douglas, whose remains will leave the above address on Sunday, at 2 p.m. for interment in the Douglas Borough Cemetery. F. Shimin, Secretary. The hearse would have traveled well below the 5 miles limit beyond which members might be excused from attending the funeral. We might therefore expect that there was a large turnout at the cemetery, since there were about 850 members of the Douglas tent in 1936. It might be noted that during depressed economic times which extended well into the 1960s on the island, newspaper funeral announcements for ordinary folk were less common than they are today. A large juvenile and adult demonstration was held in Douglas June 20, 1912 to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the establishment of the first juvenile tent on the island. The procession was accompanied by 2 marching bands. They all proceeded to the Villa Marina grounds, where the High Chief Ruler gave a speech congratulating the island for being one of the largest Rechabite societies in the British Isles. A photo of the 5 youngest Callow children dressed in their Rechabite regalia was probably taken on that day. From left to right, the boys are John age 11, Walter age 14, Charles age 8, and the girls Mona age 6 and Daisy age 4. By the time James Callow sold his boats in 1937, his health had begun to decline. It is likely, therefore, that the last annual procession in which he participated was on May 21, 1936, when the centenary of the Rechabite movement on the island was celebrated. On that occasion, 750 members marched in procession to the Villa Marina, where they were addressed by several senior officers of the organization. Although not mentioned in the newspaper account, it is presumed the customary church service and tea or dinner followed. In the evening, they met again for entertainment and more speeches. A centenary medal was issued to mark the occasion. Souvenir teacups and plates bearing a colored version of the Rechabite emblem, but excluding the pictures of the Ark, St. George and the lifeboat, were manufactured by Grafton Works for various districts to commemorate the centennial of the Rechabite order. They were also made for the 125th and 150th anniversary. A 150th anniversary cup for the Isle of Man district is in the Manx Museum. James Callow lived in both good and bad times. World War I would have been the worst, since the boating industry all but shut down, and he would have had great concern for his 5 sons in active theaters of the war. After World War I, he continued to be successful in his business despite the economic depression, and remained so until his short retirement, which lasted only 1 year. His best times were likely from the time of his marriage in 1887 to the beginning of World War I. During this time of relative prosperity, there was rapid expansion of the tourist industry and much building of infrastructure on the island. The writer was fortunate to have taped an interview with Bobby Ash, a veteran boatman, who as a young man knew James Callow when he was approaching retirement, and who recalled details about the early boating scene in Douglas. Several relatives still living on the island as well as others now living in the UK and Ireland also recalled stories and anecdotes. This account could have been prepared some years ago, but the interview tape was lost and only recently found. The writer was also hoping to find a long article about James Callow in a Manx magazine, which he remembers being shown to him when he was a young boy. Unfortunately, magazines for the period of time in questions are not indexed and the article has not been found. Quoting a phrase from an old will calling to mind the uncertainty of human life, it has been decided to finish this account of James Callow with the information at hand. Perhaps someday the article referred to above will be found and more details about James Callow's life will be revealed. According to one informant, there were also other articles written about him in Manx newspapers over the years, but they have not been found on a newly created newspaper index. May 2007. May 2007. May 2007. May 2007. May 2007. May 2007. May 2007.